Thank you again very much, Prime Minister, for your speech and your warm welcome in this beautiful setting and for hosting us. Now, it says here, introduce the Commissioner, but I'm pretty sure I don't need to do that. Everyone in the room knows who you are. What this panel is going to be about is EU entrepreneurial ecosystem and whether it's creating or curbing competition. Now, as any good tech journalist does, yesterday I decided to crowdsource my questions to you today. So I went on Twitter and I asked the world what they wanted me to ask you today. And you would think I would get some terrible suggestions, but actually I got some very sensible questions. And the main thing that people are asking is, what is the future of competition? What does good competition look like to you?
Well, good competition is what is serving customers well. That we can enjoy affordable prices, choice among different qualities, but also innovation, because competition is a great driver of innovation. And both when we as citizens are there in the role as consumers, but also I think as citizens in this continent and within our union, competition will serve us well, because Europe obviously needs to stay in the absolute high end of the value chain. And if we are to do that, well, then we need to keep innovating. And in that, competition is a very good thing. Also because I think it's important that if you want to innovate, especially if you're a small business or a medium-sized business, then you need to be able to trust the marketplace, that you have a fair chance of making it. Because if you find that the bigger guys, they are above the law, that they can do whatever, then how to find the courage to invest yourself, your resources, your knowledge into producing something new?
Well, you say innovation, and it might sound very cynical, but we hear in Brussels all the time this phrase, don't stifle innovation. And often, when I hear that, what I hear is, oh, just let us do whatever we want and make money. I mean, that breeds a sort of atmosphere of distrust for companies, does it not?
Well, I think that Europe has shown how a European approach has made us all very rich. It's a very prosperous continent. Just look at our host country today. Since the EU membership, I think the gap from being about 50% of EU average, next year it will be just slightly over 80%. And I think of the 12 countries in the Union that will grow the most, the next year, the Visegrad countries obviously are among them, but so are all the countries that has come into the Union most recently. So this European way of doing things, where there is a very good and close relationship between competition and regulation, that creates on the one hand side the trust, but on the other hand side also the drive.
Well, we hear a lot, obviously. The big cases that are, always in the headlines are those big tech companies, and they are predominantly American. And you've been sick to death, I'm sure, of being accused of being anti-American, but can you at least address that? Because it comes up again and again.
Yes, and I take that very seriously, because it's one of the sort of the very fundamentals of our European Union that we put equal treatment into real life. It's not a theory. It's not just in our textbook. But equal treatment, no matter what flag you're flying as a company, if you're a newcomer to the union or you're a founding member, if you have opt-outs like my own home country, if you're a small country or a big country, if you're private or publicly owned. So I always take that very seriously. And if you then go through our work, you'd find that it's not being a US company or a European company. Of course, we enforce much more with European companies. Lately, also, we had a big case with Gazprom where we have imposed binding commitments to allow prices to come down. So I think we can fend for ourselves. The thing is more that since we're in a technological, digital revolution, and I don't think we have seen it all. These first decade may just be sort of the dress rehearsal for quantum computing and blockchain, as the Prime Minister just mentioned. there will be more. And since these are formative years, of course, the companies who are the first to harvest network effects, marginal costs approaching zero, of course, there is a focus on what they're doing, because we are now forming our societies to be digital.
Well, before we sort of dive into specific cases, let me ask you about the question of size, because the cases that you end up taking on tend to be around issues of dominance, which by nature means they're large. But SMEs make up 99% of the EU economy. So where does competition play a role when you're thinking of that sector?
Well, let me offer two perspectives. One is, of course, that if you're a smaller business in a national market, the National Competition Authority will make sure that you're not faced with competitors who, for instance, cartelize or have decided to do things that they shouldn't in misusing maybe a national dominant position. And I think this is very important, and sometimes I wonder if this model could not be used in other areas as well, where we have a strong competence within the Commission, but we work completely integrated with our national competition authorities who actually enforce the same legislation. But to do that on ground, to make sure that consumers in retail, in construction, in some of the national markets are well protected. Second thing is that if you look at the European business structure, of course we have gigantic companies, but we also have a lot of companies who are completely dependent on the network of small and medium-sized businesses. And that gives both a stability and a flexibility that is unheard of in economic zones where you are dominated by giant businesses. So it's not just for sort of the festive occasions, it is for real that the medium and small-sized businesses, they create the jobs, they take the young people on board for apprentices, they pay their taxes. So obviously for us, it is important to keep the market open for them to do their business because they are an enormous contributor, probably one of the most important to European prosperity.
Well, the other area now I want to get onto is it's very tech heavy, which is my bread and butter, so I'm very happy about that. You've talked a bit about the idea of data as a commodity. Sort of lay out how that would work, because even relatively small in terms of employee companies might be processing an absolutely enormous amount of data, and you get into an awful lot of issues there around fundamental rights as well as competition and consumer issues.
Yeah, but so, very close to home, when we do a merger procedure, we would look into what role will data play here. Maybe it's nothing, because the data the two businesses merge is something that you can easily copy, or you can buy it, or you can create it yourself the next day. But maybe they merge sets of data that will work as a unique source for innovation and a barrier to entry for other businesses in this market. And that could give us a concern. Where the first situation will give us no concern, then the last situation may give us concern. And this is why we analyze in depth what role will data play as a resource, as an asset for businesses when they merge. And then, of course, we keep an eye open as to if privacy can become a competition issue. I think we still have some way to go, because the new, stronger rules and rights that we have are still new in the making. But what one cannot exclude that it will also be an area of competition, because you can expect services that will compete on the quality of the protection that they can give you as a citizen or as another business.
Well, I mean, the logical extension of that would be that companies that have amassed too much data and are in positions of ridiculous dominance, which we can admit is sort of the case, do you go down the road of saying they need to be broken up or broken into segments?
Well, that, of course, is an interesting question, to what degree size matter in that respect. I think it's an important discussion, but maybe it's even more important to discuss how to get access to data. Because now we know that we all own our data, but the thing is that we give very often a royalty-free license for the big companies to use our data almost to whatever. So for smaller businesses to get access to huge amounts of data, to be able to innovate, to be able to provide services, how can we enable us to give this access since we now own the data? And that, I think, is sort of the next phase, as to figure out how big data can be available also for small and medium-sized businesses who are just in the process of getting there.
And of course, there's a distinction between personal data and non-personal data,
Yes.
to conflate the two. The other question that comes up repeatedly is the speed with which competition cases move, and the Commission in particular. I mean, we're talking about digitization and the speed of innovation, and a world that's moving incredibly fast. How can even competition keep pace? Competition enforcement.
Of course, first of all, we have to look dangerous, because the best thing is, of course, if the rules are not broken, which is a good reason to give out fines that have a sufficient level to have some deterrence. There is one thing, though, that is inherent in the work we do, and if I may give a parallel, if your house is broken into, it may take 5 minutes for someone to get in, find your valuables, out. But it will take the police weeks and the court system months to find the guilty person, to judge the guilty person. Because we live in the union based on the rule of law, and you have the right to defend yourself, and cases should be fully supported by evidence. And that asymmetry in time is, of course, also our asymmetry. And since we will never compromise on due process and the right to defend yourself, and that our cases should stand up in court, of course, there's a limit to how fast we can be. That being said, of course, we should digitalize as well. And we do that. Should we have an algorithm so that we can police the markets to see what the other algorithms are doing out there? But also, should we have new rules? And I have asked 3 extremely insightful people, one with an expertise in economics, one in competition law, and one in tech, to come together and to give advice, and they will give their report by March next year, to look into the future, how to make sure that we make the best in the marketplace in this digital revolution. And we will also have an open conference by January next year for everyone to come and to offer their perspectives, so that we make sure that we also get the right regulatory tools to be able to stay relevant for all the businesses who want to compete by the book, but to need an open market to be able to do that.
Okay, now I'm going to come to some questions from the floor in just a moment, but I have another question that I got off Twitter, and if you do want to tweet at us during this, you can use the hashtag TATRA Summit 18. So, please share beyond the swoon and this lovely setting what we're talking about. One of the questions was, what attracts AI talent to Europe? It's a little bit off your beat, but have you any ideas?
Well, I think to a very large degree, quality of life. Of course, not everyone can live here where the air is crisp and sweet, but in many other places, you have also very high quality of life. You may have another work-life balance. You have access to very good infrastructure. Both partners can have a job. You have very good educational system for children. I think one has to realize that we have so much to offer, both when it comes to quality of life, also when it comes to the quality of doing business. Because Europe sort of can cover the full palettes of what you need. Reasonable taxes, high-skilled people, research and innovation, good governments, very good infrastructure. All of that is working very well for us.
Well, you mentioned taxes. We'll probably come on to that in just a moment. But first, let me see. Anyone in the room got questions that they would like to ask? No one? In this audience? Okay, well, let us come back then. You mentioned also very fresh air, so I feel like I should raise Dieselgate as an issue as well. I want to ask whether, we see these scandals and these breaches of competition and abuses of dominance. Does this create a sort of, I sort of asked this at the beginning, but do you believe it actually creates distrust amongst consumers?
Yes, I'm afraid so. Because for more and more consumers, it makes a difference that you are actually not polluting the environment for your co-citizens. I think that one thing is to say, well, this is the product, this is the upside, this is the downside, this is what it is. It's another thing to say, this is what it is, and then it turns out to be something else. And I have colleagues with Jyrki Katainen heading this, who's deep into investigating the diesel scandal. We just opened the investigation of another type of car cartel, which is very specifically scoped, because we, of course, want businesses to work together in an open fashion to innovate where it becomes too difficult to do it one-on-one. For instance, on security, we're just talking about the Battery Alliance. That makes extremely good sense. But what we suspect here is that a number of car companies have agreed not to use the most innovative technologies to clean emissions. To say, well, no, we will not use the best. We agree among us that we will not use the best technology to clean exhaustion from petrol cars and diesel cars. Of course, to some degree, I hope not to be proven right, because this is, of course, very sad. Because also here, of course, we need competition in innovation. Who can give you the best car also when it comes to using the best technology, in order also to drive the others forward, literally in this case.
So, I mean, that's just the cases. I mean, you're sort of highlighting more cases again there that we're going to have to keep an eye on. So let me ask you, looking to the future, I mean, do you see changes needed perhaps in the area of policy law or regulation or tax regulation, just, for the next commission coming forward?
Oh, but in that case, we have prepared very well. Because even though competition law enforcement that's a strong hammer, obviously not everything is a nail. And it is, I think, a given that we need for competition law enforcement to work very closely with regulation, as how should the marketplace work? Like in the relationship between business and platforms, because it comes back over and over again that businesses say, we have no transparency. We don't know what is happening, we don't know why it's happening, and we don't know who to turn to make it stop. All of a sudden, we cannot be found anymore. Our business is closing down. It will be in the area of taxation. On average, digital companies pay 9% in taxes. On average, traditional businesses with traditional business models pay 23% in taxes. It's a difference with more than 100%. That's obviously not fair. And we don't think that our proposals necessarily is perfect in that respect, but we're trying to update sort of the very basic concept of corporate taxation, because everything digitalizes. Data obviously also is a thing in transportation, in agriculture, in health. So we better get our head together also to figure out how should taxation work in a much more digital world.
Okay, have we any questions? Yes, sir.
Fabian Zulik from the European Policy Center. Thank you very much, Commissioner, for those remarks. I wanted to ask a question about the global dimension to this. Arguably, the other side of the coin to digitalization, to the technological development, is also the increase in globalization, global value chains, which is affecting companies in Europe quite profoundly. And we can arguably enforce competition laws, fair competition, the kind of rules which we think are important within Europe. But for our companies, it's also a question in how far they face fair competition elsewhere. So what can we do to make sure that the global environment also follows those rules?
Okay, thank you for that question. Yeah.
Because that's a very good question, which is why it is part of our social or our global strategy to fight harmful subsidies in a global manner. I have, for instance, a memorandum of understanding with my Chinese counterparts to, as a first step, create transparency when it comes to subsidies. And there's no reason to be sort of too proud of ourselves. When we stopped counting a couple of years ago, I think in Europe we had handed out, or at least made available, 691 billion euros for our financial system in order to keep that stable. And it's just to say that when you're open about what you do yourself, then you can, to a greater degree, ask openness of other people. In the trade policy, it's an issue as well. In the Japanese EU trade agreement just finalized, it's an agreement for them to do away with a number of their most harmful subsidies, the ones that we would never ever have here with the present set of rules. I think it's very important what is done in the reign of G7 and G20, who has also put this on the agenda to create transparency. In the reform of the WTO, this is also an issue, because we have reporting systems in the WTO set of rules, but they are obviously not being used to full extent. So it has to be a global endeavor to have the harmful subsidies come down. And then, of course, I think to some degree to be slightly more hard-nosed than we used to be. By having access to do screening of foreign direct investment, to ask for reciprocity, which I thought should be a given. Because trade is about having relationships, so is competition. And I think in this way we can have a very balanced approach and still within sort of our global multilateral set of rules and frameworks.
But does it frustrate you that competition enforcement gets dragged into other issues or co-opted?
Oh no, it's always great when people talk about what you do. No, I think the important thing is for the idea of competition to travel as far as possible. But I think it is for us to fend for ourselves, to say, as we, for instance, did, we have three, some of them quite controversial mergers in the agri-chemical sector, to say, people say, well, you have to consider environmental effects when seeds and pesticides get combined in one company. And what we had to say, well, we will look after the farmer to make sure that he can turn to someone else, or she can turn to someone else for a competing seed, for competing pesticides. But environmental laws, they were in place before the merger, during the merger, after the merger. And we shouldn't just put it all into one big ball, but make sure that we have the distinctions. Also because sometimes you want much more environmental regulation than what you would ever sort of put into the area of competition. Same goes for labor laws. Same goes for the control of things that can give us cancer. All kinds of regulation, and I think it is very important that we are strict to keep that in place and not putting that into sort of the ball of competition.
I mean, isn't that difficult with the whole tech sector as well, where we can't quite easily say we know what's going on, and we can't take, if you like, an almost precautionary principle approach?
That I didn't quite understand.
Well, I mean, if we have, for example, algorithms developing and machine learning, and there aren't enough experts, for example, perhaps, I mean, you have experts in the Commission, but they don't really understand the nuts and bolts to say this could be damaging. Whereas in environmental law, we will say this could be damaging, so we will take a precautionary approach to it.
Oh, well, that's a very important discussion. We have a tool of interim measures that is very difficult to use, but we've sort of opened the drawer and put the tool on our desk to be able to use it if we find a good case actually to use it for. The problem that we have is that in the Commission we have a very, very high legal bar to pass. That makes it very difficult, which is kind of the dilemma here, to use it on new things that we discover. But since it is exactly when new things are happening, you would want to be able to take interim measures. Then, of course, we are ready to use it if we find a case where it would be useful to do that, exactly because of what you say.
Well, we keep our eyes open for that. Any other questions, please? Anyone?
It's the view. They're distracted,
Yes.
completely distracted by the view.
Thank you. Nadia Kowalczyka from the German Marshall Fund of the United States in Brussels. I have a question about this taxation. You mentioned digital companies versus traditional companies. Digital companies 9% tax, traditional 23%, so we have to make it more fair. My question is your understanding of more fair making the taxes even lower? Or is it higher, especially when you would have to be accountable as a politician in the national governments, where people don't have even access or fair access to healthcare, pensions are extremely low, people live very below the decent standards in most of the European countries. So what is actually fair in terms of taxation of the big digital or small digital companies or others? Thank you.
Well, if taxes as such should be higher or lower, that is actually for national governments to decide. The point that, or the discussion where we have tabled a proposal is to say, sort of old school understanding of corporate taxation cannot understand how value is created in a digital company or how you have a taxable presence. If you take a Google search, this is not a product you take from the shelf. It's something where you create value when you do the Google search. So you're part of the value creation here. So it's actually created where you are. Of course, their algorithm and their IP and so that plays a huge role, but the value cannot be created without you doing the Google search. So we have to sort of rethink how value is created in order to see value creation and therefore also tax value creation. And the second element is to see, well, what does it mean to have a taxable presence? Because some digital companies, they never set foot in your country. Their servers, they are in wonderful cold northern Norway to save energy. But actually, they have a very good business. But they're not here. How to understand that? How to make sure that we can see when you do a good business and you create value in the country, that you also have a taxable presence. And without these concepts being updated to a digital world, national governments cannot even decide if taxes should be higher or lower, because there are things that simply escape taxation. And I think we have to do that first, and then, of course, for governments responsible to their national voters to decide, will we tax more or will we tax less? Because there can be needs in the member states that their politicians would want to address.
Okay, it's your last chance, ladies and gentlemen. Have we any more questions in the room before I go to Twitter for the most burning question of the day? Nope. So the question people on Twitter were asking is, what's your favorite cocktail?
Oh, I'm kind of a traditional woman in that. That would be a gin and tonic.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Would be my pleasure.
Thank you, Commissioner. And we got to the end of that without anyone using the phrase, data is the new oil. So well done, everyone. Now, I would like to invite to join me, please, Daniel Kurtyński, who is the Chairman of the Board of Directors of EP Holding. Thank you, Daniel.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
So a very straightforward first question. You were listening very attentively. What struck you most about the Commissioner's remarks?
They were indeed, many of them, very inspiring. And I wouldn't say that anything struck me on its own, but what I would add and probably follow up on what she rightfully indicated is that I think really we are in a situation where, especially for digital economy, we cannot rely only on antitrust. We all need to be mindful of the fact, and it's quite paradoxical because actually I'm representing the business sphere, but we have to be mindful that with the digital economy, we have entered into a zone where the traditional monopolies are effectively toys for kids compared to the monopolies that are rising up today. Maybe I can quote a few figures. I'm sure most of you will know them. But anyway, the share of 9 largest digital companies on the digital economy, on the digital revenues, is 90%. 4 out of the 9 are in China, or located in China. 5 are taking care of rest of the world. Combined EBITDA, so the gross earnings produced by Apple, Google, and Facebook, are $160 billion annually, which is probably 10 times Slovak state budget annually. And it's growing by 20% for Google and 50% for Facebook. We have globally 4.5 to 4.7 billion users of mobile devices, out of which 90% is served either by the Android produced by Google, which is I think 77%, and remaining 13% by Apple. Share of Google and Facebook on the growth of digital advertisement is well above 90%. Not only that, we have the new problem of big data. And the problem of big data is that effectively big majority of the big data in an organized way is in the possession of these big tech companies. These big tech companies are also leaders in the artificial intelligence. The best existing algorithm is the AlphaZero created by DeepMind, which has been acquired by Google. More, I would also add that an important feature of these companies, and I can 100% understand it, and I have to say that I fully appreciate their great contributions to our lives, to the economic growth. In a way, they saved us. Otherwise, I think we would have faced serious issues, but they've enabled a new wave of innovation. And I'm actually very much admiring what they were able to create in so short period of time. But we also need to appreciate that these really global monopolies of unprecedented scale, never ever in the history any company was even close to have the power of the big tech, and especially Google, who is paradoxically bringing also the highest value to the society. So we have to say that these companies have still the spirit of growth and taking over. So contrary to the much, much smaller monopolies in the physical world or real economy, they keep growing. If they see a potential competitor, a new force that could change, that could move the needle and change the balance, they would immediately acquire it. Facebook owns Instagram, Google owns YouTube, Google acquired DeepMind, which could have moved the needle in a different way. So we are in a situation that existing antitrust rules, even with all the efforts of the commissioner, cannot bring answers to these questions. I think we seriously need, and this is in the interest of the big tech, we need a completely new regulation that would set up rules on which we can rely, rules that would mitigate the biggest risks before the big tech eats us and themselves. But at the same time, rules which then would be, if possible, stable, so that they can rely on it and they can understand what is their space, where they can grow, and which rules they need to follow, because they are bringing the service and they deserve to be the biggest companies in the world, which they are today, and for sure they are going to exponentially grow in any case. Maybe to that, allow me 3 or 4 small examples and then I'll stop talking. Imagine the world of energy, which is my original world. Everybody who knows the third energy directive of the European Commission knows how strict rules we need to follow. There are strict rules of unbundling. There are strict rules saying how and in how much independent way you can operate power or gas transmission system, distribution system, storage system, supply, production, or very, very strict rules. If you operate an infrastructure, you need to always operate it in a transparent way. You need to allow free access to all players in an equal way. Internet is a huge communication infrastructure. It's an information infrastructure, the most global one. Never we had any global infrastructure of any similar kind. For that infrastructure, we have absolutely no rules. Effectively, Google, Facebook, and all the other companies, without these rules, I have to say logically, what they are doing, they are effectively hard selling their own products. When talking about transparency, now with the new algorithm of Google, Sometimes, if you want to find the first unpaid result of the search, you need to scroll on your mobile, etc., etc. But I wouldn't say that this is their problem. This is really the problem of completely missing rules, because in that situation, the structure just takes the place. So that's one example. The other example, which is for me absolutely striking, is the example of regulation in the media. If you are a small publisher, probably producing a magazine that would have 10,000 readers, you have tons of obligations in terms of protection of third parties' rights. And you are responsible for all the content in your little magazine. If you are a Facebook and you are operating, or you are effectively operating because they are operator of the structure, you are operating a public web page that has 6 million users, you have no obligation, even not to know, you even are not obliged to know who is producing the page. It's like if we had a huge TV channel that would broadcast all over the globe and broadcast to the mass of population any content, even the most naughty one, with the arguments that they didn't produce it. Unthinkable in the real world, but fully realistic in the digital world. For taxes, dear Commissioner, I would share with you the reality of this region. In this region, and sorry, I will use the Czech example because it was for me faster to find it. In the Czech Republic, Google generates probably, because it's not published, probably 200 million euros of sales. The taxes are 0.1% of the sales, 200,000 euros. The taxes of Facebook are, to make it simple, zero.
Okay, before we go on, I've a voice in my ear, and it's not just in my head. You've covered a lot of ground there in one big mouthful, and I want to try and pick apart some bits of it.
Sorry for that.
So, I mean, one of the things there you said, I mean, we're supposed to be talking about entrepreneurship in this section, and you talked about Google gobbling up, or not just, I mean, Google, it's in my eye line, but you know, these big companies. But I mean, you can put laws in place, but if there is a culture where startups are really only trying to be, and their measure of success is to be bought by these big companies, isn't there some sort of cultural change that needs to happen there?
I think really we cannot rely on culture, and the simple reason is that the digital world is evolving super fast. The companies need to think super fast and need to act super fast. We really need to define the playground, tell them, and I repeat again, if I was a shareholder of Google, I would really support that idea, because otherwise there is no other way than we will, at the end of the day, either really have a giant problem or witness new Rockefeller case, or rather an antitrust case that would put the famous Rockefeller case somewhere completely in the corner, because it cannot continue. So what I think really we need to think about the right rules. What is the degree of vertical integration? To what extent, for instance, big data should be public, and there should be a free access to it in a structured way. You know, to what, and now we can think of many others. For instance, the topic that I've quoted for me is an easy one. Why somebody who is effectively producing a media business in the digital world should not have the same obligation like somebody in the real world? You know, and there are many, many questions. Of course, I don't know the answers. But what I greatly believe in is that really there has to be a new regulation. But what is crucially important, the regulation must not be a fight against the big tech. This would be completely wrong. It has to be a debate about what are the good rules and the rules which are sustainable. So the trade-off for the big tech is to tell them, unfortunately, this is not how it can go, because it's far too much. But these are rules we will stand behind, and if you are within the rules, then you can grow and you can do your business. Maybe they will have to give up some businesses. Maybe artificial intelligence has to be separated from the company that is owning the big data. Or maybe it has to be run in an independent way. Maybe if you have search, you need to give up other parts of your business model. All that has to be debated. But ultimately, there is no doubt that the growth of these companies is going to be exponential, and this will be the they are already today far largest companies in the world, and they are going to be much bigger in any case. But I think the trade-off is for sustainability. And for your question, the money in the digital world is there. By the way, I have a remark here. The three companies, Apple, Google, and Facebook are holding on the accounts $370 billion US, 20 to 25 times Slovak state budget. So I think for the guys who are willing to, to develop their own products and then be bought by them, there is enough, and there will be much, much, much more. So that motivation is going to be preserved regardless, and any rules are going to be implemented.
Well, I mean, taking for your example there of the media company, we did just see a vote in the European Parliament last week on the AVMS, the Audiovisual Media Services Directive,
Yeah,
that is pushing for that. So,
Yes.
you need to get out and
That's
lobby.
an important initiative. Yeah.
But let me unpick a bit this idea of big data, because big data is not just simply one thing. Big data is made up of personal and non-personal data, and they're treated in hugely different ways. And you've got, within the realm of big data, you've also got open data. And, there were plenty. Last week I hosted the EU Datathon, which was, encouraging young people to develop apps using the EU open data portal. I mean, there's only so much in terms, that's like EU institutions backed project. But if we do then think that the data is a commodity, how would you persuade a company to give away their commodity? Who would do that?
It has actually happened many times in the real world. And again, I feel now a bit strange because, again, I'm not a fighter against the big tech. By the way, my main business is energy, but we have invested also in e-commerce, and I'm a great believer in that business and in the value of the business. But at the same time, there were situations when one company owned the infrastructure, it owned all the clients' data, it served the whole business. In the energy business, in the energy world, that has been the business model 20 years ago, fully implemented. Now we have a completely new business model where the infrastructure is separated from the client's business. So something which has been unthinkable in the real world can be implemented. Of course, it's much more complex. But I'm just simply saying we really need to think about the rules and start to also signal where it will go, because otherwise it's going to be a huge crash. And it's, I would say, 5 minutes after 12 for me.
Have we questions? Oh, wow, very fast. Okay, I don't know who was quicker.
Good afternoon, I'm Ondřej Houska, journalist from Hospodářské noviny, Czech newspaper. Mr. Křetinsky, you have also spoken about the media, and you own media in the Czech Republic and now also in France. Why are you now investing, let's say, quite massively in the media? What's your business plan there, or why are you going from the energy sector now to media? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, straightforward question, and I'll answer to that in the same way. Of course, it has more angles, but the main one is that I'm a true believer in the fact that traditional media and traditional journalism are effectively an incredibly important pillar of European democracy. We have lived, and our democracies have worked in a sustainable way based on the principle, by the way, of quality interpretation of information. The European citizens were for decades or centuries given information and immediate interpretation of the information. The interpretation of the information was the work of the qualified journalist. So the person from the street, the normal citizen, has received information, this is what has happened at the level of state budget, at the level of the international affairs, and then immediately you received the interpretation. It is good or bad for this and this reason. And the interpretation played an enormous role in the education process of the voters for the elections. And we had a quality vote in the Western European democracies for many decades, high quality vote. What we have now with the domain of digitalization, unfortunately, is a change of behavior of us, the citizens. And what we are doing on the internet is that we are just scanning what is happening there. We are reading only the titles, if we read any web page at all. And the reason is that we are really bringing up a generation of complete political ignorance. Our own education goes down and the new generation is completely ignorant. So what I think that it is really necessary to support this. And because of all the trends, the media houses are so strong, so weak, and so much underneath that unfortunately they need to be sponsored. And this is what we are doing.
And unfortunately, we have to leave it there because we have speakers for our next panel waiting. But it's such a huge issue. Thank you very much. I'm sure we will talk much more about that in the coming days.